Good evening and welcome. I'm Renée Battle-Brooks, the Executive Director of the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. We are the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. For the last 2.5 years, our agency has partnered with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System to bring you some virtual events on a wide range of subjects, from voting, democracy in action, or does your zip code impact your whole life, to conversations with great authors. One such conversation happened almost 2 years ago when I had the privilege of speaking with Dr. William G. Thomas about his incredible work about enslaved people in Prince George's County who sued for their freedom. This book really started a series of things called Freedom Stories in collaboration with our office, the library, Joe's Movement Emporium, and the Prince George's Community College's Center for Performing Arts. So one of our events for Freedom Stories was a legal panel in which Attorney Gabriel Christian, present tonight, and Judge Sean Wallace, also present tonight, spoke about the legal implications of these suits. It was a great conversation, and Horvath is working backstage doing the tech for us. They will put the link on the screen. And if you're wanting to look at the chat later to see what that conversation was about, we welcome you to do that. That event really led us into a conversation about the importance of the rule of law and democracy and the ways that democracy and the rule of law intersect. So tonight, we're going to further that discussion, particularly because today is the United Nations International Day of Democracy. And so we're honoring that with this second part of the conversation. We are thrilled again to be in partnership with the library. We're thrilled to have Judge Sean Wallace and Gabriel Christian back to talk about this. Before we begin the conversation, I just want to give a brief biography on both of our esteemed guests. First of all, Judge Sean Wallace has been a judge of the Circuit Court in Prince George's County, the 7th Circuit of Maryland, for, since 2002, when he was appointed by the then governor. Judge Wallace is a founding member of the American College of Business Court Judges and was president in 2013 and 2014. He also has been active in international rule of law efforts since 2014. He's trained judges from China, from Kenya, from Nigeria, and he consulted with judges from Myanmar and Tunisia. Prior to his appointment to the bench, Judge Wallace was the county attorney for Prince George's County. And prior to that, he was in private practice for a number of years where he focused mainly on federal and state litigation. So welcome, Judge Wallace. Thank you. We also have Gabriel Christian. Gabriel Christian is a highly skilled veteran trial attorney and a Georgetown Law School graduate. His areas of legal practice include personal injury, litigation, criminal defense, church and religious organizations, international law, commercial law, business organizations, family law, personal injury, environmental law, and sustainable energy law. He's deeply involved in the community and in community service. He offers his time to citizens of Maryland and business organizations, religious organizations, the school system, and the Caribbean community. He is an accomplished writer, and he has so many books. I'm only going to mention a few, but his works include In Search of Eden, Dominica, The Travails of a Caribbean Mini-State, Rain on a Tin Roof, Death by Fire, and it goes on and on. So please Google him for more of his books. He is a member of many bar associations, civic associations. He serves on boards, and he is just active in his community. So we thank both of you for joining us this evening. And I thought it would be good to start off with laying just a little foundation for those who maybe didn't hear the first conversation, so that we can, when we start our discussion tonight about democracy, there's a framework. So Judge Wallace, if you wouldn't mind going first, we would really love that.
Sure. So I guess this kind of was a spin-off from that prior program that we had done, the Questions of Freedom. And as that discussion developed, we talked about how it was important and actually surprising that slaves were able to use the justice system to their advantage. And that really kind of opened up this discussion about rule of law and its importance in a democracy. So everybody knows what a democracy is. A democracy is government by the people. What happens is we, the people, pick our leaders in free and fair elections. And Professor John Kerry from Dartmouth had said that next to that fair and free election aspect, one of the most important characteristics of a democracy is the rule of law. And the reason is because while citizens of a democracy choose their leaders in those elections, the rule of law defines the relationship between the citizens and those representatives or leaders between the elections. Obviously, if we're unhappy with what they're doing, we can throw them out in the next election. But in the meantime, the rule of law kind of defines the relationship between citizens and those we have chosen as our leaders. So one aspect of rule of law is that the law applies equally to everyone, whether the most lowly of citizens, if you want to call them that, even to the most powerful government officials and elected leaders. So the rule of law applies equally to somebody, who, an 18-year-old who has just graduated from high school and is looking for a job, as well as it applies to the President of the United States or the richest man in the country, whether it's Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos in every given day. So that's one aspect of the rule of law. The second aspect of the rule of law is that laws are created by a transparent, open, predetermined process. And they're not created by the whim of whoever the most powerful people in society are. And that's a key distinction between true democracies and other types of government, is that, for example, if you want to look at Russia, they claim to be a democracy. President Putin was elected, although he was elected in elections that everyone else says were not free and fair. But when he decided he wanted to stay president beyond the term limits, he changed it. And because he could, that means it's not a true democracy. When, if Joe Biden decides at the end of 2 terms that he wants to stay on longer, he doesn't have the ability to change the rules for his own benefit. That's the difference between our true democracy and, a false democracy in places like Russia, the Russian Federation. So I think that kind of lays out a little bit of the what we're talking about today: democracy, which we all kind of have a good sense of, and then rule of law, which we as lawyers may have a sense, but a lot of lay people do not. And I think that's a good way to start the discussion.
Thank you. I think that's a really, really good foundation. Gabriel, we would love to hear your foundational part.
Well, not too long ago, a certain lawyer, whose name I will not reveal, went to a certain judge in this county, and the name of that judge will remain, let's say, outside the 4 walls of our conversation, on a bond hearing. And the state took a position, defense counsel took a position, and the judge basically went to his book. He looked at the memo, and he asked the state's attorney, well, Mr. Christian has made, this particular argument, which seems to comport with what the law requires. What say you? What say you to controvert, rebut, otherwise overturn proposed, Mr. Christian, in a way that is rooted in precedent and is rooted in statute. And when he was unable to do that, that particular judge went by the book, and he did not give the state any advantage over the defense counsel. And he ruled that the defendant was to be released. That is rule of law in action. In many countries, there's no concept of habeas corpus. The idea that someone has committed an act is in prison, and now we want to get that person out, bring the body to the court, and have the court demand of the state to explain to the court why this person should not be released. Or, as in the case I just alluded to, have your attorney file a motion for bond so that it can be reviewed without any thumb of an oligarchy or a tyrant or a political party, I might say. Be not thumb on the scales of justice. The reference to Putin's Russia is a very good point. It's one of the reasons why we don't hear a lot about the Russian Supreme Court. If there is one, I assume there is a Russian Supreme Court.
There is.
Judge Wallace is elected in many countries, and I take what he said to be true. So there is the facade, or there is the sort of profile of laws and statutes being separate and apart from the state power. But in too many instances, we don't have rule of law. Ergo, and I say, as they say in old Latin, de proceed pari passu. They go together. I do not believe you can have a democracy without rule of law. I do not believe you can have a democracy where, as Judge Wallace noted, no one is above the law. The president in his palace, the former president, the most wealthy CEO, the most wealthy land developer, or the pauper in the street. They all have to be given the opportunity to be heard, to have their day in court, and to be afforded the opportunity to make argument. I just want to recite some of the essential set of rule of law criteria that we've grown over the years, about at least those of us in the tradition of the British common law, which in a great many ways is, I don't say this in any way to be ethnocentric or to be, let's say, insular, but in many regards has provided sort of the gold standard. You know, in many countries that are not U.S. territories, because of television and the movies, people will say, well, I take the fifth. And in their particular country, there's no constitutional section or subsection called the fifth, but they will use that to say that they assert that right that Miranda provided to U.S. citizens or those persons on U.S. territory who are going to be judged within the parameters of our judiciary and our judicial process. But they've accepted that now as almost a universal principle. And it speaks to why I believe, imperfect though we are here in the United States or in the British system of law as it was given to the colonies, and of course, you know, I said to someone as the debate came up about the Queen's passing, colonialism was a human enterprise with all the barbarism of all human enterprises and all the nobility that can be found in human enterprises. You know, it was not all of one or all of the other. One has to be able to look at that experience and extricate from it things such as the rule of law. And we'll talk about justice stand in a moment. But some of the rule of law set of principles we've become familiar with are as follows. All persons are to be held accountable and held equal under law, to include leaders in all sectors, government officials, agents, representatives, and the other. That's number one. Number two, the laws in any country must be clearly stated, stable, fair, and protect fundamental rights, as in freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, etc., including the security of the person and their property. And a lot of those freedoms came out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A lot of that, of course, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had a great U.S. imprimatur. A lot of that was rooted in U.S. constitutional law, because the United Nations, from which it came, was a creature of the great powers, United States, Britain, France, Soviet Union, but they acceded to that, or at least agreed with those principles in principle, if not in practice. Number 3, the process by which laws are enacted, administered, and enforced is accessible, fair, and efficient. And number 4, access to justice is provided by competent, independent, ethical adjudicators, attorneys or representatives, and judicial officers who are of sufficient number, have adequate resources, and reflect the makeup of the societies that they serve. So that is where we are. But it took us some time to get there. Yes, we were rooted in the Judeo-Christian ethic of do unto your neighbor as you like done unto yourself, the golden rule, so to speak. And but we had to go through colonialism, slavery, in the United States, Civil War, before the Civil War, the 1857 decision of Dred Scott, to get us to a perfect place. But what was interesting about the last discussion was that even in the darkest days of slavery, despite the 3/5 clause, enslaved African Americans were able to access the judiciary, unlike Dred Scott, though, and win. And that was what I think triggered this discussion, that if we can hold on to principle, that even in the most difficult times, where those principles are fair and equitable and rooted in that ethic of do unto others as you'd like done unto yourself, we will get to a better place and democracy will thrive.
So you raise an interesting question. I'm going to pose this for both of you. So we have these wonderful things that are the rule of law and principles, and we've got, we've talked about the judiciary, et cetera. But we're living in a time right now where there seems to be an eroding of the confidence of a judiciary that is fair and impartial. I'm not saying on local levels, but if you're watching or listening to some of the national news, sort of some of the federal systems, right? And so I'd like us to really talk and discuss about what role do we think confidence in the judiciary plays in democracy?
I guess I'll take that first. I think it's essential that that the people have confidence in the judiciary, in the rule of law. Somebody, and I can't remember who, said the judiciary has no soldiers. They have no army to support them. It's just the support of the people. And so the people have to feel that things are being done in a just manner. Everything that I do every day, I probably make at least one side unhappy, and sometimes I make both sides unhappy. But if they feel that they've had a fair and just opportunity to be heard, then even though they're unhappy that they didn't prevail, at least they felt they've had their day in court. If parties don't have that, then the rule of law becomes suspect, and thus the democracy becomes suspect. Frankly, that's part of what you see going on here, is the questioning of all the institutions that we have, because people who don't like democracy want to call those things into question, whether that's from foreign powers that are trying to affect our election or criticize things. And you hear about all these Chinese bots and Russian bots that generate controversy online and social media, or from domestic people who criticize. When someone says, oh, that's a Democrat judge or that's a Republican judge, I've served with both. And both of them, both parties and judges from those parties, really, in my experience, try to rise to the occasion to be impartial. And I've ruled against people that supported me when I ran to be elected as a judge, that's just my job. But if people think that you're only doing it because you've been bought and paid for in some manner, then they don't have faith in the judiciary. They don't have faith in the fair application of the laws, and they lose faith in the democracy. So I think it's essential that we fight against those efforts and try to maintain a sense that we are all trying to fairly apply the laws.
Yeah, and before Gabriel answers that, I just wanted to echo what you said. I know that as a practitioner appearing in front of you and other judges, the most important thing for me, no matter which side I was on, was that I felt like my position was heard. Whether it was agreed to or ruled in my favor was sort of secondary. But I agree with you that the idea of knowing that when you go in front of a judicial body, that each side has the ability to have a fair hearing. And I know that I've had discussions with non-lawyers who, when we're talking about the confidence and sort of talking about how it is important that we do have confidence in our judiciary, really relaying to others that I know that I've appeared in front of judges who maybe politically don't think the way, but that was never even a consideration. That was never a thought that any rulings would be based on a personal political view or personal views on matters, that it was strictly the law, the facts, and how it, what the application is. So I just wanted to echo what you said, that a fair hearing is so critical to credibility and to confidence in the judiciary. Absolutely. Gabriel.
I'm very humbled by what Judge Wallace said. And it reminds me, he sort of paraphrased what the late, great Judge William Missouri said to the assembled commissioners sometime in 2006, 2007, when I was quite surprised to get a call one evening from the Lieutenant Governor about the Judicial Commission, and I'd been asked to serve because I'd been recommended. And so when we went to Annapolis, Judge Missouri came out and he was quite eloquent. He says, and it's kind of a paraphrasing of what Judge Wallace says, the executive power has the power of the sword, has the National Guard, has the state police. The governor can declare a state of emergency. That's the power of the sword. The legislature has the power of the purse. They can fund you, defund you, write the laws that the executive must comply with and the judiciary must interpret. They've got the power of the purse. The judicial branch, all it has is the power of the pen. Looking at it, compared to a sword and compared to billions of dollars, it would appear to be the weakest power. But in a democracy, I dare say, it is the most important power. Because the moment that any one of us steps out of our house in the morning to take a walk, make sure we can keep our weight down, or keep our arthritic knees in good order, we are actually exercising our constitutional rights. Because in a tyranny, in an anti-democratic society, you may just be confined to your house, as has been the case in so many countries, without any recourse to the courts, because that has been placed under the hegemony of a political party, as in the case of China, where the Communist Party of China is the power. So how much elbow room does a judge in China have if the party decides that Renée Battle-Brooks, Sean Wallace, Gabriel Christian is an enemy of the state? Whatever that means. I mean, I'm not sure what that's even codified as to what an enemy of the state means. And so in our system today, I think the danger that exists, and it's been happening, I remember Justice Scalia being particularly adept or maybe very commonly seen at events, seminars, programs of people of a particular ideological orientation. So that's our judge, you see. Clarence Thomas, at events of a particular political orientation, That's our judge, you see. Then you begin to see the corrosion of that hallowed place that the Supreme Court and other courts are supposed to reside within. I'll never forget, as a young lawyer and with dear Franklin Bourne, and all the judges usually come back in the good old pre-COVID days, and Judge Salmon, who had been introduced to me as a law clerk by no less a person than Thomas A. Farrington. He was at the bar. And, you know, Thomas A. Farrington had something called a World War II club with Judge Casula and Jerry Devlin and the others. So I said, Judge, can I buy you a drink? He said, no, Gabe. I'll buy my own drink. And, you know, he was a member of the World War II club. And so I wasn't trying to be chummy. I knew him and he knew me, and I thought I'd do the polite thing. But he'd inculcated in himself, even in that moment of familiarity, the principle that it would not do good for Gabe to buy me a drink, because maybe next week I may be presiding over a matter where he's one of the attorneys. And there must be not just impartiality, but there must be the appearance of impartiality. I never forgot that.
Yeah, and that's so I, as Ms. Battle-Brooks said, I have done some teaching of rule of law in overseas, internationally. Two things struck me. One, I was teaching judges from China, and the topic of my presentation was about science in the courtroom. They didn't ask any questions about science in the courtroom. What they wanted to know about was what would happen if I made a mistake and was reversed on appeal, or I did something ruled against the government. And I said nothing. And they were shocked. They just couldn't understand the concept that a judge could rule against the government and not lose his job or somehow be punished. So that's the government aspect of it. And then I guess pre-COVID 2019, I was in Kenya a couple of times teaching other things. Electronic evidence is what the topic of my talks. Not with the judges, but with people in the community. They'd say, oh, you're here from the United States. What are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm training judges. And they'd say, train them not to be corrupt.
Wow.
Now, I don't know that they were. All the judges that I met seemed to be very honest and straightforward people. But the public perception of at least some of the people was that the judges were corrupt. And so that makes things difficult for a democracy. And it's not just judges in Kenya. I mean, I think there's this feeling that many officials are corrupt. And so they're trying, and that is a growing democracy. They just had a new election, and unlike in the past, they had an election that was disputed, and it went to their Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court upheld it, they agreed. And the opponent, who had been running for probably 50 years for president and had been endorsed by the sitting president, he conceded. And the sitting president, who had endorsed him, appeared at the formal investiture to hand over the sword of state to his successor, who he had opposed. There was no violence, as there has been in the past. So they are getting better at moving into that democracy where the people do trust that officials are fair, and that the courts, more importantly, are fair, and the laws are being applied equally to everyone. And that's essential to a strong democracy. And Kenya is probably a shining light in that area of the world, in that regard, where there are a number of autocratic governments and non-functioning governments. So they are kind of, they're getting there. We're getting there. We thought we were solid, and it took us I mean, we haven't been a real true democracy for about 60 years, right? I mean, when it was passed, when the first Constitution came in, it was white males that were allowed to vote. They had to pass an amendment to allow other African Americans to vote, then another to allow women to vote. And even though legally they were allowed to, they de facto weren't allowed to. And it wasn't until, the Civil Rights Acts of the mid to late 60s that was really given teeth to allow them to vote. So it's only been 60 years that we are truly a democracy where everyone has a chance to participate. But we're getting there, and it's a growing thing. Democracy is it's a messy way of governing. Having a dictator is great. They make a decision and away you go. It's efficient, but it's not fair and effective. And if you've got a dictator who's insane or crazy, you go off on a far different path. Whereas, kind of the group effort of the group of people, the group wisdom helps keep democracy slowly but surely advancing in, I think, a way that everybody agrees. We're not always advancing with the same speed, but I think over time we are advancing, and hopefully we'll continue to do so.
Yeah, it's a very interesting perspective, and you're right. We do like to think, that we've had a couple hundred years or 100+ years of democracy, but you're right, because democracy means when everyone has fair and free access to vote and to participate in it. There's something that you said that I think it is worth discussing for those who are listening, and that is, when a judge is appointed, and then subsequently, depending on how it works in each jurisdiction, either runs for election or re-election, or when you work for a state agency as a prosecutor, right? There are oaths that we take, right, to uphold the law. So let's talk about that, and really how that works and how that really goes into the building blocks of democracy.
Gabe, you want to go first, or?
I've given this a long, hard thought in recent years. What if General Milley and those with him believed that their allegiance was not to the Constitution of the United States, but was to the party of their affinity? What if? Then we would, on January 6, 2021, have been witnesses to a coup d'etat in this country. And when the call came, because the call did come, as the evidence will show, to overturn the election, that every single petition that Giuliani, former mayor of New York City, Giuliani, I will mention his name now, filed, be it that those were filed in courts presided over by Republican judges, or judges who had been, appointed by Republican presidents in the federal system, Democratic judges, or judges who had been appointed by Democratic presidents. Let's not call them Republican judges or Democratic judges. They should just be judges. He lost every single petition. That was a tribute to the whole idea of impartiality. He did not bring the relevant proof. The proof, whatever proof was tendered, did not rise to the relevant burden required. And so, having failed with those election petitions, those who gathered on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th resorted to brute force. And with the expectation that there would be those in the U.S. Armed Forces who would have supported them. There was one U.S. Air Force colonel. Imagine that, a colonel That's the rank next to general, who was cut inside of the U.S. Capitol with zip ties and all geared up and ready to go. I thought to myself, this to get to that level, I worked I did procurement law, and my mentor was Rear Admiral William Ryan of the Defense Logistics Agency, and he wrote one of my letters to law school. So my first job was working at Lytton in College Park on DoD contracts. So that environment is one that I understand, and I know that there are a lot of seminars on democracy, rule of law, and we go out overseas to do nation building. So to get to be an officer at that level, you've had to be sort of groomed in U.S. constitutional principles. But the culture was not there. And so he found himself in that motley crowd. But there are other officers who stood fast. And so we're here this evening. Because all of this issue of human rights and democracy, we may have been in a fascist state by now. And so democracy is really something that is rooted in culture. So even during that period that Judge Wallace correctly speaks of, where we were just partly democratic, in that we had elections, we elected Lincoln, but it's white males. Then the 14th Amendment, you had African-American mayors and others, and then women couldn't vote, and then you had women in 1921, I believe. But even then, you had Thurgood Marshall in Prince George's County coming to court to represent an African-American and chased out of court. Licensed attorney, future Supreme Court Justice. Prince George's County Sheriff said to him, it's in the book, Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary by Juan Williams. I purchased it at Martin's Crossroads at one of the famous J. Franklin Bourne dinners that he was a keynote speaker at, I think, Juan Williams years ago. Chased out of court. Because our system had not yet accepted there was parity between a white lawyer and a black lawyer. So we've made enormous progress, because even during those dark days, as the initial text that we looked at last time we were here, Freedom Suits, spoke to that abiding principle that allowed for enslaved African Americans to come to court and get justice. Even within the slave power, even during the time of the hegemony of the slave power, there was that reaching towards the principle. That was the same thing that applied in the Mansfield, in the Somerset case with Lord Mansfield, when the West Indian lobby in London, in fact, the saying was, as rich as a West Indian. When they said West Indian, they didn't mean black people. They meant the West Indian planters, the merchants, when sugar was king. Mansfield did not yield to the superior dollar power of the West India Committee, which was the most powerful lobby in England. They were furious with Mansfield because their fear was if he let Somerset, the African-Americans, enslaved African-American who had been sort of absconded with by the abolitionists, Granville Sharp and the others, and they baptized him in the Anglican Church. And why they did that? Because their feeling was, here was a Christian, a good Anglican. He can't be a slave. How can you enslave an Anglican? And Mansfield's ruling stood despite the powerful lobby, and they were concerned that if Mansfield's decision was allowed to stand, it would filter down to the British colonies in the West Indies, where I was born, much later, of course. And it would I'm not Benjamin Button. Is that Benjamin Button? And it would have overthrown the slave system. And in a way, the Somerset case eventually did that. It wasn't immediate, but then you had the abolition of the slave trade, and then you had the abolition of slavery in 1834. So rule of law in the United States and rule of law in the United Kingdom, coming from the same root, pursued with relevant vigor and reason, based on the old Judeo-Christian ethic of the golden rule, do unto others what you'd like done unto you, has been at the root of the success of what I call the democracy project, which is ongoing. It's not a finished project. And it requires eternal vigilance, like the watchman on the wall. I think that was Ida B. Wells.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is oaths matter, oaths to the Constitution, and that takes precedent over personal allegiances, personal beliefs, personal whatever. That when you take an oath in when we're talking in the legal system, to uphold the Constitution and the principles thereof, and to whatever your role is with that, to do it in fairness and justly for all. Yeah. Judge Wallace, did you answer that question? I'm not sure.
No. The interesting thing about oath, yes, that Army colonel had taken an oath, and the military generals who were prepared to send support to the Congress took an oath. They all take an oath, as do judges, take an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. It's interesting that the 14th Amendment, which we all kind of refer to, due process and equal rights, that was the first section of the 14th Amendment, which was passed and ratified after the Civil War. The third section has an interesting provision that said if anyone has taken an oath to support the Constitution of the United States as part of their becoming a senator or a congressman or other officer of the United States or any state, if they've taken that oath and then they engage in insurrection or rebellion, they can't serve any longer. And of course, in the 150 years since the Civil War, there really wasn't much of that going on. But after January 6th, there have been some cases that have been brought, and the first one that has been successfully brought to conclusion is in New Mexico recently, where an elected county commissioner had been arrested and convicted for being involved in January 6th, invading the Capitol. And he was thrown out of office based on the 14th Amendment, based on his having taken an oath to support the Constitution, which he then had obviously broken by attacking the Congress when they were trying to ratify the election. So oaths do matter. In court, everybody takes an oath to tell the truth, and I'm not sure. Some people don't tell the whole truth, perhaps. That's part of what a judge or a jury decides, who's telling the truth. But oaths matter, and an oath to support the Constitution matters tremendously for elected officials or appointed officials. If they're that colonel, I think he was a retired colonel at the time on January 6th, but if he was still on active duty, he'd have lost his job because he had sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States in his oath, and he had broken it by engaging in that insurrection on January 6th. So yeah, oaths definitely matter, I think. And they're essential to the rule of law. I'm promising to follow the law. I, as an official of some kind, a government official, am promising to follow the law.
So I think that leads to another question, and then we'll ask if anybody has questions. Maybe you can start shooting them to us. But so, yes, oaths matter and the law matters. And so talk to us a little bit about if a law is a bad law, right? You still have to uphold the law. What in a democracy, what happens next? And maybe bad law really isn't the correct term, but if a law is
unjust, I mean, it's
perhaps unjust, yeah, or right, just yeah. What in a democracy, what do we do? What is the proper way?
I think ideally what happens is people recognize that there's a problem with that law, and they join together to have the law changed. Whether it's by referenda, if that's the way it can be done, or by electing people as their representatives to have the law changed. A lot of elections do turn on that view, when people are talking about their record, the record of an elected official, they're saying, look, they passed this law or they opposed that law. They passed this bad law or they support or they oppose this good law, and therefore you should throw them out and put someone in here who's going to pass good and just laws. And that's the way, ideally, a democracy, that laws are changed. They might have been seen as fair and just when they were enacted, and then time has shown that they're not. Or it may be that at the time that they were enacted, everybody knew that they were unjust, but they were forced through by the elected officials at that time. But ideally, that's what happens when there's a bad law in some regard. The people gather together and exercise their franchise. They exercise their right to vote to have representatives that will change that law. That's the whole theory behind democracy, that we're not stuck with bad laws that somebody else gave us and we don't have any ability to change.
Yeah, and in the interim, those serving in the judiciary, whether it's judge or prosecutor right, the job is to uphold the law, right?
Right. Now, prosecutors, obviously, they have what's called prosecutorial discretion. They can say, I'm not going to uphold a law that I think is unjust.
Right.
I'm just using my authority not to bring criminal charges against somebody who I think is subject to an unjust law. But a judge can do it in the sense of saying, this law that's I'm being asked to enforce is unconstitutional in some manner. And so a judge can say, no, I think that law is unconstitutional. I'm not going to apply it. But otherwise, if it's legal, just an unwise law, we have to apply it.
Yeah, there's a question here from Daniel. If confidence in our judiciary has been eroded, what will it take to restore confidence?
Well, it takes change by those who are charged with administering our laws in the courts of law. If you are a Supreme Court justice, you ought to have at least some influence in your household to make sure that your wife is not involved in sedition. I would like to think. I tell my children whenever they go out on the street, they represent our name. They represent our family. They're not representing themselves. We're all charged with that, what Judge Wallace called oath. Now, she may not have taken an oath, but I'd like to think if you're married to someone, you don't want to embarrass your husband and embarrass your wife. And I believe the practice. So I was born a British subject. First passport I had was a British passport. In that system, the judges do not stand for election. I don't necessarily think it's inherently superior, because we are now in a situation where now China is very influential. There were no Chinese when I grew up on the island. China's embassy is the biggest embassy on the island. The Chinese all over. God bless them. They have money now and they can travel and they can buy property. But now we have a judge in a particular case who arrested a friend of mine who was an economist at the World Bank, and he left the bench to take a call. Can you imagine Judge Wallace leaving the bench to take a call from a politician? So what we do as judges, what we do as prosecutors, what we do as defense attorneys, all of us are part of the body politic or the body corporate or the gross anatomy of the judicial system. We're all part and parcel of it. And we all have a duty to ensure that we conduct ourselves in ways that impart confidence in the citizenry that the entire thing is not going to hell in a handbasket. Impartiality is a core principle. I don't think it's wise for Supreme Court justices or federal judges to be at highly partisan events giving their opinion on things, because it's going to give the average citizen, as it I think already has, the idea that you're one way. And what you're going to do is almost predictable, which means the whole idea of reasoned judgment and process theory all goes out the window, because you are somehow beholden to a particular ideological framework that resides in the great lost cause and grievance, and the idea that we can, in this time, make the United States a white-only ethno-state. The greatest redeeming quality of the United States is that, again, coming back to freedom suits, that they were white Americans who were part of the elite, who, when they had to make a decision, you know, one of the most heart-wrenching stories is the story of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the 54th Massachusetts. I ask all Americans to get his biography. I ask all Americans to understand the movie Glory is not just a movie. He was the only son of wealthy Bostonians who were white Bostonians. They were abolitionists. And they worked with Frederick Douglass and the government to set up this regiment. And I'm answering this question, what does it take to install confidence? It takes a moral center. And so many white officers didn't want to be associated, giving weapons to black people. Oh, that's something they hung John Brown in West Virginia for. No, it wasn't West Virginia, that in Virginia for. West Virginia came about as a result of the Civil War.
Yeah, Harper's Ferry, right?
They hung him for insurrection. And now you're trying to legitimize what John Brown was hung for. So the project was at a standstill. And his parents went to him, his father went to him at Antietam. The Battle of Antietam had just taken place, and implored him to become the commanding officer. He said, no, I'm happy with my friends. I don't, he was not an abolitionist. He was the son of wealthy parents. He traveled Europe, been to Harvard. He's a Harvard man. He said, I don't want to deal with those. He used the N-word in a way his parents would not. But he was very beloved by his mother, and his mother was more persuasive. And his mother wrote him, and she said, we want only the best white men to associate with this unit. Can you, son, please do this for your loving mother? That the enslaved African American, they didn't use the term African, colored people is what they used the term. That the colored people are children of God. And that the colored people are due their rights just like you and me. This is Robert Gould Shaw's mother. She is employing him based on the Judeo-Christian ethic of do unto others as you'd like done unto you. White woman of privilege, high privilege. She was persuasive. He left his unit, joined the 54th, became the commanding officer, and as we all know, in the first major battle at Fort Wagner, I believe South Carolina, he was killed. And when they asked his parents whether they wanted to send his body back to Boston, because, there were racial codes, they couldn't bury whites with blacks, they said, no, bury him with his men, who he had grown to love so much. And so, for those who are looking for some sort of way to get back to a place of understanding, let's go back to the core value system that those who founded this country, where that core value system has been rendered real, in reality, made manifest, we've had a better go. Where we have departed from it and resided in prejudice, ethnocentricity, grievance, victimology, malice, bias, hate, then the democracy project has gone backwards, as it did after Reconstruction ended.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabriel. Judge Wallace, would you like to answer that? I think we'll probably end with your answer.
Well, I think, so the question was, what happens if that trust is lost?
Yeah. How do you restore it?
All trust, that once lost, it's very hard to regain. It takes a lot of effort. From the judges and the lawyers' perspective, it's to continue to do things in a fair and impartial way, and to show the community that that's what's happening. even if there may be a judge or two judges or dozens of judges who are now partisan and not, that is not true for everybody. And I think part of it is these kind of efforts to educate people as to why judges do what they do, how they make decisions, so people have more confidence in that. It's not, I'm just not picking a side because of, who buys me a drink, or who, that somebody paid me money, or who I went to school with, or what political party I am. I'm making a decision based on the law because that's what the law mandates. Even if it's a decision that a law that I don't necessarily would, if I was a legislature, would have passed or voted for. If it's been adopted, I'm applying it. And so I think it's important for everybody to kind of engage in that civics lesson of what do judges do? How do they do it? Why do they make the decisions? In the hopes of kind of regaining any trust that has been lost. Because you see then the reasoning and the basis for it, and hopefully people will understand and maybe not be happy with the result, but they'll understand how it was reached, and they'll understand it was done in a fair way, and that's obviously the most important thing. But yes, once that trust is lost, it's a lot of work to regain it, as in Kenya, where I don't know that it's true, but it was perceived to be true. And it takes a lot of work to overcome that perception, even if it's not a reality.
Very, very true. Democracy dies in silence. That's it's not an original quote, and it's incumbent upon each of us, everyone that's listening. I'm sorry. Yes, Gabriel.
There are two questions that I wanted to quickly respond to. One
Okay.
had to do with the Electoral College. I believe
Okay.
in one man, one vote. I believe the Electoral College came out of that time when African Americans were 3/5 of a person, and it was to kind of keep the timid mob, keep the masses away. The Constitution was brought up at the time of a slave power's hegemony, and I believe it has outlived its usefulness. I do agree with Molly in that view, and I do believe that the United States was a prime mover in the founding of the United Nations. If the strong nations that founded the United Nations dismiss it out of hand and deem it to be irrelevant and don't go by the laws that they themselves instituted, then I think we'll be out for a very rough road in way of wars and rumors of wars. I think the United Nations was set up as an institution for peace, or law courts were set up to resolve conflicts between citizens. And when you go to a mediator or a judge to preside over a matter, we expect that impartiality, and that impartiality comes from that old golden rule. We didn't just fall out, from nowhere. We had core values that then gave, as a man thinketh, so is he. So the core values that we had from our sort of, maybe religious background or whatever, certainly Judeo-Christian ethic, that infused itself into our Constitution. And where we followed that principle, I think we've done well. That's my view. And I just want to say this has been a wonderful opportunity I hope we'll have more opportunities to illuminate the subject.
Yeah, I think it's an important discussion to continue, especially because we're in such uneasy times, I guess is the way to say it. And a lot of people have lost confidence. And I think, again, like we have all talked about tonight, that confidence is essential, and the feeling that there is a fairness about the law is essential. That they're fair in administering, and fairness in how it's administered. Yeah. So, and I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but we want to thank everyone for tuning in, for participating. I especially want to thank Judge Wallace. I especially want to thank Gabriel Christian for your time and your thoughts and your thoughtfulness on this subject. And for those listening, please, if you want to listen to the last conversation or other conversations, please go to civilrights.mypgc.us. That is our Office of Human Rights, where we have all of the different events on the page. Thank you to our wonderful partners, the library system. Thank you to O. Horvath, who spent time with us this evening on tech and ensuring that we were able to do this tonight. So thank you, everyone. And please stay safe and have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.